Hi, this is Dahu. Today I want to take you through a melodic techno track I produced using only Ableton Live instruments and samples by Production Music Live. Let's take a look. Let's just listen to the break and the drop, which is kind of the focal point of this track, just to get an idea of what we're going to be looking at. Alright, let's just look at it top to bottom. As you can hear, it's the track is very focused on the melodies and focused on kind of these beautiful swellings and recedings of these synths. But there's actually a lot of drum work that went into this track, so I just want to start with the drums because this is where I also started producing this track. So let's take a look at it and just solo the kick and the drums for a second here. Okay, we've got a pretty tech housey loop here, but still pretty soft. And the first thing I want to focus on maybe is the kick. This track is quite the opposite to the last one I produced as a template, since it's much softer, much more acoustic, much more in line with something from the drum perspective, at least, that someone could have, individually played and recorded. So I would say less industrial, more organic. And so we've got a very different kick here, first of all. And take a look at it here. We've got a layered kick, a very subby component with a very very delicate click, and then here we've got, I'll turn the solo off here, and we've got a top end here that makes it more audible in the mix, since this subby kick is very very soft, and it wouldn't actually cut through the mix and also not sound as good on systems that don't have a lot of bass if we don't add that on top here. And the thing I want to mention here is when you're producing like softer kicks, a lot of the time people think, okay, a long kick is going to be hard, a soft kick is going to be, a short kick is going to be softer. But actually I think it's just as important to look at the click of the kick. So I think the more mid-heavy the click will be, so like the higher frequencies right at the start when the kick hits, the harder it will be. So in this track I wanted to have a very delicate click, a lot of high ends, not so much in the mids, to make sure it'll carry this more softer approach that I wanted to have in the track. So it would be really odd here if we would have like this super punchy kick, like punching through the mix. So it's always important to not only pick a kick that you actually, like, but that also is in tune with what the track wants to do. And since we've got all these kind of more delicate soundscapes here, I tried to make a kick that's also a little bit more delicate. Okay, moving on to this drum part here. We have a lot to unpack. It's a lot of channels, because I actually really love building drums, so I kind of go overboard a little bit usually with it. But that's also good for you, since you actually get access to this template, and there's a lot of stuff I think that you could work with here. So first of all, one thing that you can notice maybe, we just solo the drum channel. So basically the bass structure of this groove is this shaker up here. That's what kind of gives it the organic feeling that I started with. All right, next let's take a look at these drum channels here. Definitely a bit of a departure from the last template I did. These are much more organic, much more in tune with, what an actual drummer might play. And I have kind of an advantage there because I'm a drummer myself. But I maybe can share a few tips with you what you can do to kind of transport that organic feeling a little bit more. So one thing that's really important here is the open hi-hat, because that kind of mimics what a real drummer would do. So the open hi-hat is open right before the second clap hit, so before the 3. Yes. And that's kind of, you know, kind of a standard groove that a drummer might play as well. So if you don't have any experience with playing percussion yourself or with being a drummer, it also helps to just listen to basic grooves, you know, to understand kind of patterns that a real drummer might play and try to look at mirroring that in your drum channels. And actually the Deep Premium Volume 6 sample pack by PML is perfect for that, because there's a lot of actually recorded drums in there that actual drummers played. So that's a great way to start and kind of make your drums sound a little bit more organic by kind of mimicking what a real drummer would do. And then also in this track, we have quite a lot of drums in the beginning, and then later it gets super melodic. But we have kind of a longer build-up period here where we've got a lot of drums, not a lot of melody. And I often run into this problem where I want to have a simple groove at the beginning so DJs can mix it well, but then I also want to have a nice transition to the break where all the, you know, the melodies will come in and really take over the track. And I don't want that shift to be super abrupt. You know, I need to already transport some vibe in the beginning melodically to make sure that it's not like I don't have part 1 of the track and then part 2 of the track and they don't really gel together in the middle. So one thing I like to do here in the drum channels is put a little bit of melodic information into the drums. So if we listen to them here, there's this clap metal here. And this is tuned using the corpus to A1, A sharp 1 here. And this kind of, from the vibe, pushes the track already, even though there's no melodies running, into this kind of melodic realm, so the transition later when the melodies will come in will be much more natural. So that's just a little trick to make that transition easier. Ultimately what we're doing here by tuning this clap to A sharp here is we're already setting kind of a harmonic vibe that the brain of the listener is already picking up on. It's already settling into a certain atmosphere, and once these heavy melodic elements will come in, it will seem much more natural because we've already kind of pushed the track very subtly in the direction of a certain harmonic range. And that will be much better than, you know, just having the drums run, and then the melody transition will be much more smooth if we already teaser it by just tuning these percussive elements from the start. One other thing that we can hear here is we've got these like odd little sounds now and then that just kind of spice it up a little bit, bring a little bit more dynamic range into the whole thing, or just make it a little bit more interesting. And one channel doing that I want to highlight really quickly. That's, I think it's this one. No, it's actually this one. Okay. So a lot of randomness is going into this one, and if you guys watched my last video, you know that's something I really love, to just introduce some sense of randomness into my tracks to make sure that happy accidents, or to set myself up for having happy accidents, or just keep it interesting also when you're producing. You're listening to the same loop over and over, and it just spices it up a little bit to introduce a generative effect into it, so sometimes you just surprise yourself. Actually what's happening here is we've got a corpus that's pitching down through the LFO, and then we've got a beat repeat back here with a chance set to 60%, so that will trigger sometimes. And that's basically the generative aspect of it. It will sound different every time we play it back. And I wouldn't do that with an entire groove, you know, because you need a fixed structure in your tracks. It is, you know, dance music, you need something to grab onto. But for these like one-shots that come maybe once every 16 bars or whatever, it's just a really great way to introduce some variation in your track without actually having to do a lot of work. And as I said earlier, a great way to surprise yourself and, you know, set yourself up for those happy accidents. All right. So you can hear the beat repeat actually grabbing the second part here and repeating it. Okay, and actually we can also make super crazy effects with this, for example, by increasing the decay of the corpus to very extreme amounts. Yeah, you can hear actually on the tail end of that sound, we've also got the beat repeat working. So that's just, I think combining the corpus with the beat repeat is a crazy way to really quickly get really interesting results in terms of sound design. There's one more channel actually that I want to take a look at, but that will actually come into play a lot later. So if we listen to the drums again, solo these two. So we've got in the background this loop here. If we can go into it, we see again, I basically used a pretty organic percussive loop and I sliced it up using this slice to new MIDI track function I just described or just showed. Made this percussive loop with it. And it's just basically setting the scene a little bit in the background, making it a little bit more organic. But this will also come into play later. So just keep that in the back of your mind. This is a much more important channel than it looks. All right, moving on to the bass. If you look at this, there's almost nothing going on. I mean, there's basically, how much is this? Like 25 bass hits in the entire track. Let's just listen to what it sounds like quickly. That's basically it. So this track is, it doesn't have a lot of bass, which, you know, if you end up getting this template, opens up a lot of, there's a lot of room here to explore what else you could do with this. But of course, you know, it is a house track, so the bass is still important. So I want to show you what is going on here. So first of all, why we don't need that much bass. I think there's, in the pads and in the leads, there's a lot of standing sounds, like kind of a big melodic carpet. And I didn't want to muddle that up by having like a standing bass. So the bass is very sparse, you know, it's more like a groove element, not so much a song element. And you can see that here we have very short basses and very sparsely used. And then we also have in the kick channel ghost notes. The kick is playing ghost notes. So if we actually solo these two together. So that's basically all that's going on the bass end. But I think this is kind of an important lesson as well. If you have a track, you know, it's always, you only have so much frequency spectrum and you have to fill it with something. And if you just filled it all up to the max, then, you know, every one of your channels will suffer. And in this track, I made the conscious decision to leave more room for the pads, leave more room for the leads, and have like a much more ethereal sound that way.
Hi, this video is sponsored by us. If you like these tutorials and want to support the channel, check out our website packed with online courses and professional sound packs. If you want to cut years of your learning curve, check the PML Beginner to Advanced Music Production program for Ableton Live. You will know Ableton inside out and learn how to write, produce, mix and master complete tracks. You learn step by step at your own speed, from an empty file to professional production, as if we're sitting side by side in the studio. Thank you for listening, and now let's get back to your tutorial.
Let's move on now to the focal point of every very melodic track, which will be the leads. The lead synths here. And basically it's pretty simple. We only have 2 lead synths. One of them is kind of a very slow arp that changes over time, gets more complex over time. And then we have a gated sample. So first of all, let's just check out only what the synth sounds like in the break. Okay, here for the leads channel, for the all-important leads channel, we have here the acid machine, which is an Ableton preset that I tweaked very slightly, and it's based on analog, and it's got like a resonator in there, reverb in there, although we're not using the resonator. Could actually delete that. But it's playing sort of this Arpy sequence that will increase in speed and complexity over time. So in the beginning, we have a very simple sequence that's basically just trying to set up the track melodically. So this part here actually, I would say, serves a much more atmospheric purpose than a melodic purpose. It's just there to introduce the sounds, to make sure that these parts where mainly the drums are playing aren't devoid of melody, basically. So if we listen to it here. Yeah, very simple ARP, only basically there to set the scene. The more important stuff will happen back here when actually this ARP or this synth really opens up and creates these melodic peaks here. So this is the drop point, basically. This is the point where the synth will have to have its highest energy, right before the drop. Basically, it's a very simple ARP that's programmed in just with the MIDI notes here. And I just added these accent notes at the beginning of every tonal change, just to give it more energy, to make it a focal point, also to have like a character element in this track. And then we've just got a little bit of automation going on here. Let's see if we can analyze that really quickly. So obviously we're playing a lot here with the filter. So basically with this synth it's pretty simple. We want the filter to open towards the drop, and then we've also got we're also playing with the resonance here to just give it more bite. So as the filter opens, we're also kind of peaking the higher frequencies or notching them a little bit to make sure it can this kind of, because it's actually kind of a soft synth the way it's set up, so we want to add that bite to make sure it can punch through the mix at the right point. And let's see what else. Okay, we've got a little bit of reverb going on here just for the atmosphere and the break. We've also got an automation here on the utility, so it's basically going from -2 dB to 0, and then it drops back down to -2. So my problem here is that, you know, since we have a very soft kick, we have pretty heavy side chaining on all of these channels to give the kick, especially since it's so soft, room to punch through. But since this is also a very melodic track, I really want these melodies to unfold completely and be unimpeded by the sidechain here in the break. So oftentimes I will just create a ghost kick channel and sidechain everything, so everything in the break would also be sidechained. But here, since this is a very melodic track, I didn't want to do that. The problem is, sometimes if you don't do that, the drop can be kind of underwhelming, since this part, you know, is not sidechained, and then the volume will be dropped down as soon as the sidechain gets the signal from the kick again. So here I'm just adding 2 dB right when it drops to compensate for the volume that the sidechain is removing, because before it was sounding just a tad underwhelming, and that really fixed the problem. So sometimes the simple things already go a long way to really deliver the energy. Okay, finally we have this swell channel, which is split into high and low. So we've actually got a grouped group which I wouldn't recommend, but in this case, you know, made sense. So I've got an auto filter opening here. All right, let's look at what's actually happening here. Let's look at this channel because this is definitely the more important one. So basically they're split into high and low. So this one is pitched roughly 1 octave over this one. And they're also pitched differently throughout this progression to create kind of chords. I'll explain how that works in a second here. So the important thing here is the gate, and that's where this percussion channel we talked about earlier comes in again. So both of these channels are gated to this percussion channel. That's also why it's the only percussion channel that runs throughout the break here, because otherwise there would be no sound coming from these two channels. And if we turn the gate off, this is actually the sample I started with. Let's go further into the track. Okay, let's take a look at this. Basically, it's just a one-shot from a Production Music Live sample pack. So this is the original, if we transpose it to 0. So this is what I started with. And then I transposed it up 1 octave and looped it. Whoops, let's turn the loop back on here. And then this is what we get, first of all. And then I kind of built a melody by just chaining these after one another and playing with the transpose function. And since we have 2 channels here, we can actually play chords. So for example, this part here is transposed plus 15, and the corresponding lower chord is plus 7. So I really like this, very nice, very powerful sound. The problem is, once I came up with this, it was super oppressive. Like it just sat on top of the track, and everything else in the track did not matter anymore because this sound was so massive. And that's a problem I have a lot of the time. Like you put a lot of work into all of these channels, and you have a concept for the track, and then you make this element that you really like, but you can't make it fit, because it just, you know, deletes all the other elements. And the way I came up to solve this here is by gating it. And that's where this percussion track I talked about earlier comes in. So I had this, as I said, you know, I started building this track with the drums. And this was actually a much more important channel in the beginning than it is now. It also had, you know, a bunch of sound design stuff on it that I've now removed, because what I want from it is mainly the groove. But what I'm doing here is I'm gating both of these channels to this percussion channel that kind of makes up the groove of the track to me. That means that these 2 channels will only produce sound if they are triggered by a sound coming from this channel. That means we can replicate the groove of this channel in our melodies and take out like this, you know, oppressive carpet of sound that we had before. So let's just compare what that does with the track. Turn off the gate again. Yeah, you can hear it's a nice drop, but it just obliterates everything. I could even lower the volume, it would still be too powerful. And also, you know, that's also not what you want to do. You don't want to have like one of the focal elements of your track be super quiet, because otherwise it's too, you know, too dominant. So now let's put on the gate here on both and see what effect that has. Okay, you can see here, basically this gray wave form down here is the audio signal coming from this channel. And whenever this gray waveform surpasses the blue line, which is the threshold, these two channels will let through sound and generate a hit. And then you can decide with hold and release what happens to the signal, you know, once it's been triggered. So the longer the hold and release are, the longer you will hear something. And the cool thing about this too is that you can automate these. For example, if you change the threshold, I'm gonna go to later in the track here when I have a higher threshold. Okay, here you can see that because the threshold, this blue line is higher, automated higher, less of these notes are being triggered. And that's like a great way to have progression in your track without actually programming progression in your track, simply by manipulating the threshold. Right, moving on to the FX channel, pretty straightforward. We have FX1 and FX2. One of them is kind of a white noise type sound, just to make the impacts a little bit more energetic. And then since it's a kind of organic track, I've also added a cymbal. So these two together sound like this. So this repetitive sound is the white noise, and then we've got the cymbal to just blend it into this more organic style groove. Lastly, let's look at the pads here. I've got kind of a mix here between synths and samples. First of all, I think this sample here is very important. Because the whole track is kind of dramatic, and I didn't want it to be like over the top. So I wanted to put like some calming sounds in it that kind of, you know, bring it back down a little bit, and and I think especially since these are placed in the break, if we listen to the whole thing. It's actually barely audible, but I think it does a lot. To me, this is like the quintessential way I use a pad. It's not super audible, you know, it's not in the foreground, it doesn't take attention away from the important elements that carry the track, but it's just so important to pull the atmosphere in the direction you want it. Okay, and then we've got another one of these elements. This is actually that we've gated to... We've got another element here that we've gated to the percussion channel here. So let's listen to it solo here. Okay, I'll turn up the gain. Also very subtle, but I think another great thing about this gating strategy is that you can turn pads into percussive elements. And I'm always looking for these elements that are like half melodic, half percussive, and that's just a great way to achieve that. And also a lot of samples might be usable in whole different ways than you didn't think of before by just gating it with, you know, another sample. You don't even have to write a gate track for it, you know, you don't have to program one. You can just go kind of trial and error, open up two tracks, put the gating source and the gating destination into them, and just play around with the parameters and see what happens, and basically apply the rhythm from one sample to the sound of the other. And I think that's just a great way to use sampling in general. All right, moving on, we have this pad here in the background. Which is just for the drama. I mean, it's transposed and looped here, nothing else is happening really. It's another one of those elements that makes sure that the drums don't stand alone at any point in the track, but there's always an atmosphere carrying through it. And I think, yeah, this part is maybe interesting. I like to start with atmosphere, and then once I'm at the point where all the drums are present and you know it's time to give the listener the feeling, okay, you know, we're anticipating something, we're working up to something, then I usually take out these type sounds for a little bit just to make sure that the drums have more room to kind of push the track forward just in that build-up phase. So that's why there's a little bit of a dip here. But other than that, this is just straight up looped throughout the whole track, just as like a background atmosphere. Okay, and then finally we have two synths in here as well, together with the samples. So let's look at this one first. Very high, very detuned. It's definitely also there for the drama. This is basically a copy of this channel. You can see it here in the MIDI. The MIDI changed a little bit since then, but basically the way this pad started is I just copied this and built a new instrument for it. If you guys watched my other video, one thing I really like to do, or what I think is a great way to produce, is to have a track, a channel you really like, and to have other channels build on that channel, you know, not to go crazy and develop new ideas, put more stuff in there, and in the end you have, you're bogged down in channels that are all, you know, demanding the listener's attention. I think it's a much, or for me at least, it's a much better approach to have a channel you like, focus on it, and have other channels support it and pull the track in the same direction. And this is what I did here basically. So this is built on this one. And one thing that's really important here when you have like stale pads or you don't know what to do with them, is I added a little bit of detune here. I think this is a great example of how detune can add a lot of drama. So let's listen to it without the detune maybe. I'll take it out here. It's actually all right. It's got kind of that interstellar feel, I guess. But if we add the detune, just a little bit in both directions, just basically making sure the two oscillators are slightly apart, but not so far to make them sound completely wrong tonally. It's just much richer, much wider, much more interesting. So yeah, definitely in pads, I think adding some detune can work magic. Okay, finally we've got this main pad here, which is the one that's the most audible in the track, I would say. It's just based off this spacious choir instrument, which is an analog. This one does not have detune. Don't go too crazy with the detune, like it has to be, you know, use it sparsely. But I think the whole thing is pretty straightforward. We've got a little bit of reverb, we've got an auto filter that's like opening and closing this choir, kind of leading through the track. And then we've got it side-chained, and that's about it. We've taken out a little bit of the lows here. Yeah, this is just a really straightforward element that's super important, especially to carry the vibe here after the drop. And I think with these kind of pad structures, the most impactful thing you can do is play with the cutoff, because like even if everything else is repeated from these 8 bars to these 8 bars, they will have a completely different vibe, simply because we've got all these high frequencies from this choir pad here, and here will be much more reserved for that reason. So it kind of just opens up the other instruments. This track is a very unique arrangement that kind of just came to be while I was producing it. I mean, usually you have, you know, the structure A, B, C, D, C, B, A, you know, that you kind of have the intro, then you have kind of a wind up, the energetic high part, and then it'll repeat itself in reverse order, just like winding down to the outro. And then you're basically just copy pasting this stuff from the start to the end a lot of the time. And this track, for some reason, that didn't happen. I think the reason is because I wanted in the beginning to showcase the drums, so to have a part of the track where there's not a lot of melody, where you have the drums, that because you know, there's a lot of channels here, and I think it's you know, got a pretty cool groove and interesting vibe, and I wanted to give it some room to shine here in the beginning. And then here in the end, we've got, you know, this section here does not return. So basically we've got the complex ARP right until the end of the track. And then here it's also the same thing. We're not really teasering any elements. So the track is pretty different from bar 49 here till the end than from the beginning. This is quite kind of a question of taste, I would say. I don't mind it. Some DJs would maybe play the track and be like, okay, you know, the progression is off for them, you know, but I don't feel like that. I think it's, you know, it can be interesting to do something a little bit out of the box. Also, I really just want to give this drum group the possibility to shine in the beginning here and to just have like a part of the track where they are the focal group. And that's also maybe what makes this work is that we have all of these pads and all of these like atmospheric elements that are here in the beginning to make sure the transition from this part to this part isn't super harsh, but that we've already set the mood, set the atmosphere early enough to make sure that the transition into this very melodic part doesn't seem like a new track entirely. So if you do go for this kind of arrangement, be sure to, you know, have enough melodic elements like in the background to set the scene for, you know, when everything's gonna come in and actually open up in terms of, you know, these parts where the cutoff just goes crazy, like right before the drop. You don't want that to be too sudden. So that was it for this project. I only used Ableton Live instruments to make it and samples from Production Music Live. Most of the drums in here come from the Deep Premium Volume 6, and the sound I used to make the lead synths was from the Analog Techno Synth Shots pack. If you'd like to check out this project yourself and work on it a little bit, you can find the link for it in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.